Everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bitcoin and Markets. My name is Ansel Lindner, and today is FOMC day. Yay! I'm gonna be back live streaming at 2 p.m. Eastern to do a live reaction to that. This quick early live stream that I'm doing here, I'm gonna start reading through a series of posts that I did on another website that I hosted, and it's about world reserve currency and the history of world reserve currencies, at least in the last since 1250. So anyway, I'm going to read through that first post, talk about it a little bit, then I'm going to go offline, be back at 2 p.m. Eastern for the FOMC drop. So let's get right into it. And there we go. This is it. Okay, so we are here on the homepage, bitcoinandmarkets.com. You can see I released a podcast version this morning, episode 342. It's way old. It was recorded back on the 10th of April, and you would think that would be not timely, but I cut out all the non-timely stuff out of that episode, and we just went through a few news articles, and I think it's still pretty evergreen, at least for the next few months. So check out that. If you guys aren't subscribed on the podcast apps, just look for Bitcoin and Markets and you'll find it. So let me make sure I'm going out on all of my channels. Yes. Okay. What did I want to say about this BTCM? So I had a blog called Bitcoin and Markets Research, and we did more in-depth series and writings on currencies and a macro thesis that involved Bitcoin. After about 2 or 3 years, things slowed down, and now I'm moving all of that content over to bitcoinandmarkets.com. Just make this my home base for everything. Future writings on that will go first to paid members on bitcoinandmarkets.com. So just the $5 a month, you'll get early access to any sort of research pieces that I write in the future. And then about 30 days later, those will go out to the public. So appreciate everyone that supports over there on Bitcoin and Markets. That's how I make money off of my efforts here on the podcast and all my content. So appreciate you guys. So let's dive in here to BTCM research. I moved it to its own page on the website, and I wanted to go over this article. This is the history of world reserve currencies, part 1. I'm going to share that with Telegram real quick. I shared that yesterday, so you guys probably saw that too. And you might have read this in the past when I published it. I published it back September 21st of 2020. So during COVID, not locked inside. I live in Florida, so we didn't have a big lockdown or anything. I think they closed the beaches for a couple weeks, things like that. But anyways, it was a slower period, obviously, for the economy and for people staying at home. And so a friend of mine, Kent Polkinghorn from the Omaha Bitcoin Meetup, we said, hey, let's start blogging about different things and dive in deeply into some of these different topics. And so this is one of the series that came out of that. There's 4 parts currently, and I'm still working on the 5th part. It's been I haven't been working on it consistently, but it's still in the process of being written. But I've gotten from 1250 all the way out to 1609, which is when the Bank of Amsterdam comes in and stuff. Now, one of the themes in this series is that you'll hear most people out there against they have the de-dollarization derangement syndrome. And they say, oh, the dollar is dying because world reserve currencies only last for 75, 80 years. Of course, that history was written by someone. I don't know who came up with that idea first. It's probably some monetary historian of, the 20th century. Maybe it was an Austrian. But they conveniently labeled it that way. So I wanted to go back and see if that was true. One of the things I've always said was, no, gold has been money for thousands of years. These same monetary historians will say Gold has been money for thousands of years. Then they'll turn around and say, what the world reserve currency has changed. What does that mean? That just means the trade denomination of the currency that was gold for a long time. Anyway, so in my research here, I start back at 1250 for very important reasons, and we'll find this out as we go through here. So the world reserve currency fulfills a unique role in the global economy. It is the currency held in reserves by sovereigns, central banks, and large businesses to facilitate the financing and transactions of global trade. Importantly, all the currencies on the chart were backed by precious metals until we got into 1971 and the Eurodollar system. It is important to view the world reserve currency as the currency which, during its time, facilitated the largest trade network, period. That is one of the main points of this entire series. International trade is what a reserve currency is all about. And let me open this image up if I can. Come on. It's not letting me do that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share that with Telegram. And I want to go through this a little bit. So major reserve currencies since 1250. And I've never seen a chart like this going back to 1250. A lot will go back to around 1650-ish, maybe 1700. But very few will go back as far to 1250. So the other day when I saw that guy, he had a chart that went back to 1250 as well and had the florin and the ducat on there. I was like, oh, he definitely took this from my stuff. And I'm not a extremely well-read like academic that I would have not, I would have seen this somewhere, but I'm an economist and I've been into money for 25 years. So I think I would have run across something like this. All right, so you can see it starts with the florin, goes in the ducat for a long time. Then they have Portuguese real for a short period, and then the Spanish real, Dutch guilder, French livre, I think you pronounce it livre, British sterling, US dollar, and I broke the US dollar into multiple sections here because we have the US dollar, which is prior to Bretton Woods, had a solid gold standard. Then we have the Bretton Woods standard, which is similar, but other currencies were pegged to the dollar, right? And then the dollar was pegged to gold. And then finally, from 1971, we have the Eurodollar system, which is an unbacked credit-based system. And I put Bitcoin on here because this is the next currency, but really it could be, I probably should update this chart, that Bitcoin should have an American flag next to it, most likely, because I do think that the dollar will be redenominated in Bitcoin at some point in the next few decades. All right, let's continue on here. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine solidus, along with nearly identical offshoots like the gold dinar, dominated trade. However, by 1250, the solidus had been massively debased, leading to contracting economic integration between Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and Europe. This is the void into which the Italian city-states stepped by providing quality gold coins and facilitating trade in routes they maintained. Below, we will examine Italian coins and trace them from 1252 until 1535. So first up is the Florentine florin. When the florin was minted in the 13th century, it was the first European gold coin struck in significant quantities for more than 500 years. And gold coin is the important thing here. I mean, if you don't count the Byzantine coin, I'm talking minus the Byzantine Empire, the rest of Europe, then it would be the first gold coin struck in significant quantities in 500 years. In the 8th century, the Carolingians introduced a silver standard to Northern Europe, and they were all on a silver standard for the most part. Even back in Roman times, the main coin was a silver coin, but large-scale sovereign central bank type transactions were done in gold. So that's an important point. But the Carolingians did have a silver standard. The florin spread quickly throughout Western Europe, becoming widely recognized as the coin used in trade, debt, and accounting. A vast network of Florentine bankers formed the first large international business enterprise and when combined with a standard coin, were able to expand trade dramatically. The florin was in many ways the first modern currency. We can see aspects of our current system emerging back then. For example, modern accounting allowed the Medici Bank to balance their books amongst branches, which reduced the need to transport gold across the continent. So, if I remember correctly, wasn't it Fibonacci that he brought the zero into Italy. And then there was, I can't remember the guy's name now. There was another business guy, banker, that brought double entry bookkeeping into Italy, or was the first to invent it there in Italy. So yeah, that's the modern accounting techniques, the double entry bookkeeping. Okay, the florin was copied by others across Europe and is similar to the Eurodollar system today, where dollars are created outside of US jurisdiction. For example, Genoa's Genovino. Hungary produced the florint, and the Dutch minted the guilder. Altogether, about 150 locations minted a florin to the same weight and measure as the Florentines, the most important being Venice. All right, so we get into the Venetian ducat here. After a particularly troubling debasement of the Byzantine hyperpyron in the 13th century, the Duchy of Venice started producing the ducat, which was modeled on the florin. The ducat, so this was, I didn't include the year here, but I think it's like 2 years later. So 1254, roughly, if I remember correctly. The ducat was almost identical in weight at 3.545 grams to the florin's 3.5368 grams. The slight difference due to the measurement systems of the two states. So as close as you can get, right? But they were technically different. The Venetian coin was used throughout the Levant, Anatolia, the Black Sea, and Adriatic, circulating simultaneously with the florin in the West. The ducat and the florin were very similar and could be looked at as a single Italian reserve currency. So I have a nice little map here. Copy that. This is just something I created showing the differences where Florence, was more westward looking and Venice was more eastward looking for the most part. But the coin that they used was the same, the ducat or the florin, and circulated simultaneously in this huge trade network. Okay, in the 15th century, florins in several places in Western Europe suffered from debasement, leading to a distinction between lower and higher quality florins. The debased coins eventually evolved into guldens, while the higher quality florins were reissued as ducats. So the idea of florins pretty much went out of fashion, and that's where we see around the middle of the 1400s the separation into guldens, and the term ducat became used most widely. Therefore, by 1450, use of the term ducat incorporated much of what was previously known as the florin. In the early 16th century, the ducat's role as reserve currency peaked, and by the middle of the century, suddenly lost its dominant role in trade. This 16th century shift was similar in magnitude to the 14th century shift from Byzantine coins to Italian. The epicenter of currency now moved from Italy to Spain. Several important historical events precipitated this move: the uniting of Castile and Aragon in 1479, the end of the Reconquista in 1492, expansion of maritime exploration and trade, as an example, Columbus in 1492, and Habsburg Spain in 1516, the American silver mines in 1535. So lots of different events there that I'm going to go through. I'm going to walk through and show how those things shifted from Italian-dominated world reserve currency to a Spanish-dominated world reserve currency. Okay. The year 1497 saw the ducat come to Spain when Ferdinand and Isabella enacted monetary reform with the Pragmatica de Medina del Campo. This reform created a copy of the ducat, initially called the Excelente, but which became known as the Ducato. So that's the Castilian ducat in 1504. Again, you can see these moves from Venice and Florence and Genoa to Spain. All right, 7 years later, in 1511, Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire began to mint a ducat, which was still produced in Austria until the 20th century. These two developments, the minting of a ducat in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, fit nicely together 5 years later in 1516 in the person of Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, which included Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, and the Low Countries. He controlled the largest trade network in the world at the time, and hence the world reserve currency. The ducat was used throughout his domains, but not for long. A new standard was just around the corner. And let's see if I can make this big. I thought I could, but on this chart, you can see this east to west transition. The florin and the ducat rule for a couple hundred years. Then we have the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And everything starts shifting westward. And Charles V really embodies this westward move as becoming King of Spain and on and on. So let me share that with Telegram. Okay, we will continue this series by first looking at the monetary changes occurring in the 14th through 15th centuries, and which culminated in a return to the silver standard in 1535. And what I can do is I will go to that. Let's pull this up and go to number 2. So here we go. Part 2, World Reserve Currency. Part 2, the 14th through 15th century silver shortage. We covered the florin and ducat in part 1, a period that lasted approximately 280 years. 280 years, guys. So this is not the 80-year time frame that people want us to think about currencies, right? The world reserve currency is supposed to be 75, 80 years. That's what they tell us. But it's really 280 years was the florin and ducat standard. And we'll find out. It ended, and the next standard came about in 1535, and that lasted for a very long time. So this ended with the rise of the Spanish Empire and vastly more efficient maritime trade routes. The long life of the florin does not conform to the conventional narrative that reserve currencies last for 75 to 100 years. We will discuss why that is throughout the rest of the series, but in the discussion below, we discuss the monetary stresses building under the surface in Europe during the latter half of the Italian Renaissance standard, and which culminated in a dramatic return to a silver standard. And once again, we have this chart of the timing of all these different reserve currencies. Before we dive in, two important notes. 1, changes of reserve currency usually follow a period of new global trade conditions. That's an important point there. Changes to the global reserve currency are not what bring about new conditions in trade. Changes are, for the most part, a product of those new conditions. So first the conditions change, then the currency adapts, because the currency, what is chosen as the world reserve currency, works best in the new conditions. So it's people say, going to the yuan, they're pushing forward. They're going to consciously change the world reserve currency. That's not how it works. Okay, the currency changes after conditions have changed to something new. Though the gold ducat standard seemed secure at its peak at the end of the 15th century, there were a series of events that weakened that order and naturally led to a new dominant currency better suited to the new trade regime. Okay. Number 2, reserve currency standards are larger than a single state. The florin, for example, was a standard weight and fineness, but not all florins were struck in Florence. Genoa, Milan, Venice, Hungary, the papacy, the Low Countries, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire all minted gold coins equal to a florin/ducat. Gold was the standard money, and the florin was the standard denomination. We see below, as we move toward the Spanish real, there were many silver coins of this era, but they typically followed the same standard. All right, let's get into this new 14th through 15th century European silver shortage. Silver was the center of a fascinating evolution in money during the 1300s through the 1400s. Though much of the Mediterranean and Europe were still on a gold standard, silver remained a very important currency. Indeed, Europe might have remained on a silver standard the whole time, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, if it wasn't for several specific developments: the centralization of state power and the reduction of church authority, the accompanying widespread wars and the debasement of the coins, and a crash in European population and production resulting in a large trade imbalance. These events provided the incentives for exploration and the creation of a new global maritime trade network, which interestingly led people back to a silver standard. Let's quickly walk through some of these factors. State power over the church. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church enjoyed power over kings and had the final say when it came to dispute resolution. Wherever possible, wars between Catholic kings were avoided in favor of intermarriage, but that changed abruptly in the 1300s. We can use Philip IV, King of France and Navarre, as a particularly good example. He was a capable and opinionated king responsible for restructuring France out of feudalism and toward a more modern central state. Constant warfare against England, Flanders, and Aragon led quickly to deficits for Philip, who turned to heavy taxation and debasement of coins to pay for his military campaigns. In the first several years of his reign, Philip reduced the silver content of French coins by 2/3. So first several years, that becomes important later. It only took a few years for him to reduce the silver content by 2/3. Still not enough to pay for all of his plans, he extended the tax burdens to the clergy with a 50% income tax. Pope Boniface VIII promptly responded to this historic overreach by trying to maintain church supremacy with the Unum Sanctum, a papal announcement that the secular realm was strictly subordinate to the spiritual realm. Philip couldn't stand for this interference and moved to have the Pope kidnapped. Boniface VIII died a few weeks later from injuries sustained in that attack. The church, under heavy French influence, then elected a new pope, Clement V, who immediately moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon. The papacy remained in Avignon from 1309 to 1376, under the unofficial control of the French king. While in Avignon, the church lost much of its legitimacy across Europe, setting the stage for further confiscation of church lands and debasement of currencies as centuries of warfare lay ahead. The church's loss of prestige also had far-reaching effects in the form of the Western Schism and subsequent Reformation. But perhaps the largest single human and economic event to ever hit Europe was the Black Death. So now I go into this. The Black Death, 1347 through 1351, was the worst pandemic perhaps the world had ever seen. Estimates are 1/3 to 1/2 of the European population died during those few short years, and certain regions suffered more than others. While the scarcity of labor helped to push wages higher for those who survived, tax increases offset those gains, and importantly, overall production plummeted. International trade during the middle 14th century became dramatically one-sided. Silver streamed out of Europe to the Near East as it became Europe's major export. So silver became Europe's major export because production plummeted because of the Black Death. All right. The other export industry that was booming prior to this period, woolen textiles, peaked right around these fateful plague years. Silver demand had replaced that of gold when the Byzantines stopped minting gold coins in 1367 in favor of silver coins, and by the time of the fall of Constantinople, silver was the primary metal used in commerce with the Ottoman Empire. The perfect storm had hit Europe. Plague and war ravaged the population, production crashed, trade slowed, growing authoritarian states dramatically debased coins, and silver flowed east. By 1450, the silver content of European coins was less than 5%, and Europe had suffered 100 years of economic depression. 100 years. Can you guys imagine? The Great Depression was what? 29 through roughly 45. This was 100 years of economic depression and crashing population. I mean, it must have been one of the worst times ever to be alive in Europe, at least. The decline in European population continued well past the plague years of the 1350s. However, plague did return every decade in a less virulent form. The population did not grow again until 1470s. So from 1350, the first Black Death round came through. 120 years, the population of Europe did not grow again. Not that it just didn't surpass the previous totals. It didn't grow at all. It was cut in half, and then it didn't grow for 120 years. I remember back one of the episodes I did with FedWatch and CK, and we were talking about the limitations of GDP and yada, yada, yada. And I tend to think GDP is a useful metric, not as good as the academics might claim it is, but it is a useful metric. But it's not the best. And CK was like, well, what can we use? What's your idea? What can we use to measure this economic vibrancy? And I was like, just demography. If you have a healthy demography, most likely your economy is healthy in the long run, right? And this tells you that something was bad in Europe for 120 years. They lost half their population and it didn't come back. Not that it didn't surpass the old highs. Like I said, it didn't grow at all. All right. An interesting coincidence is the 1470s, which is when it started growing again, was the same decade in which new large silver deposits were discovered in the German mountains. And we'd argue the quality of money directly affected demography. And I can get into that a little bit more, but I think that's a pretty unique claim that I haven't seen other people make. But the quality of money actually does affect the demography. Okay, end of the shortage. Prior to the inflow of silver from the Americas after 1535, silver output in Europe itself quintupled from the 1470s to the 1540s. So it wasn't just going over to the Americas and bringing all the silver from the Incas and things. It was in Europe itself, the amount of silver quintupled. Mainly from new silver deposits in Austria and Bohemia. This kicked off a silver boom that lasted several decades and bootstrapped an economic recovery, pulling Europe out of the late medieval depression. Many different types of high-quality silver coins were minted during this period. Remember, there was a silver shortage in Europe, so when high-quality money hit European markets, it was like a shot of adrenaline. The most important of the early silver coins was the large golden groschen, minted in 1486, named for its equivalent value to the gulden, and the silver coin weighed in at 32 grams. So the gulden, the equivalent value in silver is what the golden groschen turned into at 32 grams. Around the year 1500, a Central European standard emerged of a 29.2 gram golden groschen, making 8 to the Cologne mark, approximately 234 grams, and 16 to a pound. Therefore, these silver coins would be familiar to us today as roughly 1 ounce. Substantial variations from kingdom to kingdom or mint to mint existed, with weights ranging in this era from about 25 grams up to 30 grams. But this makes sense because during this long late medieval depression of 120 years, things broke down. Okay, communication between kingdoms broke down, society kind of breaks down, at least like long-term or long distance long distance communications and things probably broke down. And so the weights and measures slowly diverged over that 120 years. And when they come out of this, going into the year 1500, they still have these slight differences in weights and measures. So that's an interesting point here. In the next post, we continue our exploration of the re-emergence of a silver standard with developments in Spain during this time. Then follow the Spanish real through the 16th and 17th century. We initially intended to include the subject, okay, blah, blah, blah. So that's where I'm going to wrap it here, guys. I do have a couple more in this series. Let me show you number 3. One of the questions that was asked at the time, back in 2020, when this first came out, someone said, hey, why is this European focused? Why is this all European focused? So I had to answer that because I thought it was a very good critique. And I believe it was from that girl, Jani, I want to say, and she's from Afghanistan. She's an Afghani Bitcoiner. And so I respected her question and I answered it in a whole post. So actually, let me just go through that right now. I don't think it's all that long. So this is a response, why European currencies in this series. And I said, deserves to be addressed before we continue to the Spanish real. They asked, okay. The short answer is yes, it is only European currencies, but for good reasons. First, our goal is to identify global reserve currencies and how they transition from one to the other. This mandates a standard currency commonly used throughout long-distance trade routes, bridging at least Europe and Asia. Until the modern era, international trade only made up a marginal amount of a kingdom's economic activity. Most trade took place in local or regional trade networks, and the spread of specie was actively discouraged. The Silk Road was a long overland trade route between East and West, with several periods of increasing and decreasing trade activity throughout the centuries. Total volume of trade, however, never reached critical mass or formed around a single currency. In some areas along the road, barter for horses, silk, or other luxury items took the place of money. In yet other places, copper or bronze coins were used. No single currency or trade emerged along the length of the road. So that's very important. The largest trade network in the world was the Mediterranean and Europe, where a single currency was used, at least a single standard. Okay. The Silk Road's rugged mountains, harsh desert plateaus, and no east-west navigable rivers made travel slow. The lack of good paved roads made impossible the use of carts to carry goods, instead relying on low-capacity camel caravans as the go-to mode of transportation. The road's many border crossings and frequent stops made it ideal for taxation and banditry, cutting into the ability to make a profit. Only in periods of relative peace along most of the route did trade flow smoothly east to west, albeit slow. Trade along the Silk Road was more like a diffusion of goods rather than the nonstop trade route we imagine today. Traders did not travel the entire length of the road. Instead, goods diffused through a network of traders. For instance, merchants from Egypt might trade with merchants from Baghdad, who in turn might trade with merchants from Tehran or Samarkand, and so on. Local traders knew the land, language, and customs, so were able to make their way faster and more safely and more cheaply too. Payments were also made along the way, whenever goods changed hands. Each subsequent trader took a small profit as they sold the goods locally and transported the remainder a little further down the road. This had the effect of not spreading currency like we imagine for more direct routes. The Mediterranean. The second reason for concentrating on European currencies is we start tour at a specific time, the year 1250, the beginning of the modern trade currency. The two currencies between 1250 and 1450, the 2 centuries between 1250 and 1450 witnessed many events that gave rise to a large-scale direct trade route, or two large-scale direct trade routes displacing the slow diffusion along the Silk Road. Geopolitical and technological advances helped multiply trade volume and incentivize monetary convergence. The the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and navigable rivers in Europe, the Near East, and Egypt made this part of the world home to the most developed trade network. These merchants reaped high rates of return due to a superior mode of travel on water. Indeed, the merchant seafaring culture of the Mediterranean was able to quickly adapt to the changing geopolitical circumstances. Sea lanes remained open despite the shakeup of empires on land. These shakeups provided stimulus to even improve trade routes and methods. All this in turn created demand for a more consistent currency. As a comparison, sailing from one end of the Mediterranean to the other in Roman times, a trip of 4,000 kilometers, would take roughly 4 weeks. And I linked that. There is a tool from Stanford that you can go back in time and kind of see how long it would take to travel places. While a 4,000 kilometer trip along the Silk Road would take up to a year. The convergence onto a single monetary standard is a property of larger, more efficient trade networks. Where trade volumes reach critical mass, the natural forces of business will select a common currency. It is a synergistic relationship between trade volume and standardization of currency. We only saw this in pockets along the Silk Road prior to 1250 and to a much greater extent in the Mediterranean. Okay. As you can see below, the Greek drachma. So I would say before the florin, you had the drachma. But let's get into this a little bit more. The Greek drachma became the basis and etymological root for coins as well as their general denomination prior to the era we are concerned with in this series. There is a common thread relating all the Western currencies back to Greece. The drachma was spread east by Alexander the Great all the way to Bactria and India, giving rise to the dram, dirham, and drama. The Roman denarius also began life as a drachma equivalent minted by Greeks in Italy. The weight of the denarius later became the basis of the weight in gold for the solidus, later copied by the Umayyads with the dinar. So this all stems from the drachma and then the gold equivalent to the drachma until 1250, basically. In China, bronze and copper cash were most prevalent throughout history, and notably were replaced by paper money in circulation in the second millennium AD, denominated in copper cash. Gold and silver were rarely used in China except for some large transactions using highly variable silver ingots called saisi. I think I pronounced that correct. Of course, this was until they were exposed to high-quality silver coins direct from European maritime trade. So then I go through some of this timeline. So coins around 200 BC, you have the drachma. It was minted from Sicily to India. And the Athenian issue was 4.3 grams. 4.3 grams of silver. The Phoenician shekel was electrum or silver or bronze. There's all different ones. The Roman silver denarius was 4.5 grams, so really close to this Athenian drachma. And you had the Chinese bronze ban liang. Around 300 years later, so skipping 300 years up to 100 AD, it was still the silver drachma, again minted from Sicily to India, and still approximately 4.3 grams. You had the Roman gold Arius, which was 8.1 grams, the Kusan gold stater at about 7.9 grams, and the copper drachma, which was about 2 to 3 grams. And in China, you had a bronze Wuzhou. Okay, then skipping another 700 years, you had the Byzantine solidus, and you can see this is 4.5 grams, and that's the same as the Roman denarius, but that was in silver, and this was in gold. The gold dinar, and it matched the weight of a worn solidus, and I thought this was really interesting when I learned about this. So, a Byzantine coin that was 4.5 grams it would be diffused out in its neighborhood around the Near East. And as it went, it would get slowly worn or clipped even. Okay. So they minted this gold dinar, and maybe the ruler, whoever the caliph was at the time, he might have thought that, hey, the Byzantine solidus is 4.25 because all of their coins were roughly 4.25 by the time they got into the Muslim world, right? So they copied that, a worn solidus value or weight of 4.25 grams, roughly. You still had the silver drachm and dirham, minted from Spain to India still, Chinese copper, and the Carolingian silver. Okay, then coins, we skip to 1250 when we started this series, and you have the silver drachma and the dirham, minted again still from Spain to India. The gold florin and ducat came in, and this was a brand new weight standard. Okay, so not before the gold florin and ducat, the weight was 4.5 grams, and that had gone back into ancient history. Okay, 1250 was a brand new standard that didn't get derived from these other coins. All right, and that's it. That's it. I'm going to wrap it there. Leave the part 4. Maybe we'll do that tomorrow or something, but that's all I have for now. Let me pull this up. Okay, guys. Well, that's all I have. Thank you for joining me. My name is Ansel Lindner. This is Bitcoin and Markets. It's a Bitcoin and macro show. Do these live streams at least Monday, Wednesday, and Friday around midday. I will be back at 2 p.m. Eastern time. That's only, what is that, hour 15 minutes from now to do a quick, I always say quick, but this stream has been about 40 minutes, and I thought it was going to be 20 minutes. So I'll be back at 2 to do a quick reaction to the FOMC announcement. And then tomorrow I'm going live at 12:30 Eastern for FedWatch with Bitcoin Magazine. So make sure you check out Bitcoin Magazine's channels for tomorrow's live stream. All right, guys. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.